Right now, without any effort on your part, roughly 14.5 pounds of pressure are resting on every square inch of your skin. You cannot feel it. You have never felt it, not once in your entire life, because you were born into it, and your body has never known anything else. This is simply what it means to sit at the bottom of a very tall, very thin ocean made of air. We call it the atmosphere, and it stretches upward for many miles, growing thinner and thinner until it fades into the emptiness of space. And you are, in a sense, already an underwater creature. You are a creature who lives at the bottom of an ocean of gas, adapted so completely to its weight and its pressure that the weight has become invisible to you. It simply feels like nothing. It feels like normal. I want you to hold on to that thought for a moment, loosely, the way you might hold a warm cup without needing to grip it. Because tonight, we are going to travel somewhere else. We are going to leave this ocean of air, the one you already live inside without noticing, and descend into a different ocean entirely. One made of water instead of gas. One so vast that if you removed every mountain, every hill, every trace of land from the surface of the earth, the water would still cover nearly all of it, smooth and unbroken, wrapping the planet almost entirely in blue. This is the deep ocean, and it has been sitting there, patiently, for the whole of your life, underneath ships and surfers and sunbathers and storms, holding within it mountain ranges longer than the Andes and the Rockies combined, canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, plains flatter than any desert, and forms of life so strange that when they are pulled to the surface in nets, the scientists who study them sometimes sit quietly for a moment before they can even begin to describe what they are looking at. You do not need to remember any of this. I want to say that clearly, right at the beginning, because it matters. There will be no quiz. There is nothing to hold on to, nothing to prepare for, nothing that will be asked of you tomorrow. Tonight, you can simply listen the way you might listen to rain against a window, or to a river passing somewhere nearby in the dark. The facts are here if your mind wants to reach for them, but they will still be true even if you drift off in the middle of a sentence and miss the rest. The ocean has been patient for 4 billion years. It can be patient with you for one more night. So let's begin the way any real descent begins. Not with a plunge, but with a slow, gentle settling downward, the way a leaf settles onto the surface of a pond, and then, if it's heavy enough, continues sinking, turning gently as it goes. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the sea, somewhere warm, if that helps. The sand is cool under your feet, cooler than the air, because sand holds less heat than you'd expect, and the tide is drawing back in that slow, rhythmic way it has, the way it has had for longer than there have been feet to stand on that sand at all. The water is a color you could almost name if you tried, somewhere between green and blue and gray, shifting with the light and the angle and your own mood, and it moves against your ankles with a coolness that feels almost like a greeting. This is the surface. This is where the ocean begins, at least for us, at least for our purposes tonight, and it is worth noticing how different this surface world is from what lies beneath it. Up here, there is light. There is warmth, or at least the memory of the sun's warmth, held in the top few dozen feet of water, like heat held in a stone after sunset. Up here, there are waves, driven by wind, driven by storms that might be happening 1,000 miles away, their energy traveling across the water long after the wind itself has died down. This sunlit layer, the part of the ocean we can see into, the part where a swimmer can look down and still make out their own feet, is called the epipelagic zone, though you don't need to remember that word, or any word tonight. What matters is only this. This bright, warm, moving layer is thin, astonishingly thin. If the entire ocean, at its average depth, were the height of a 50-story building, this sunlit layer at the top would be roughly the first 2 or 3 floors. Everything else, the other 47 floors, sits below it in darkness. And that is where we're going. Not quickly, not all at once. We're going to sink the way sediment sinks, the way a snowflake falls through still air, unhurried, taking its time, turning slowly as gravity does its quiet work. Imagine your body, weightless now, no longer standing on sand but suspended in water, beginning to drift downward. The first thing you would notice, if you paid attention, is not darkness but color leaving. Red disappears first, swallowed by the water within the first 30 feet or so, which is why a diver's cut, even a small one, appears strange and dark rather than the bright red you'd expect, almost black in fact, because the red light needed to make blood look red has already been absorbed by the water above. Then orange fades, then yellow. Green lingers a little longer, and blue longest of all, which is part of why the ocean looks blue to us from above in the first place. Blue light penetrates deepest, scatters back up to our eyes, and paints the whole sea in that color we associate with it, even though down below, that same blue light is being steadily swallowed too. By around 600 feet, most of the color a human eye could recognize has gone. Not all at once, not like a curtain dropping, but gradually, the way a room dims as you close the shutters one at a time. And by around 3,000 feet, every trace of sunlight has vanished entirely. Not dim light, not twilight, no light at all, not the faintest photon making its way down from the sun, ever again, no matter how deep you continue to go. This is not a metaphor. This is a simple physical fact about water and distance and the nature of light itself. Below a certain depth, the sun might as well not exist. It has not existed, in any functional sense, for this part of the world, for the entire history of our planet. And yet, and this is worth sitting with for a moment, this vast, permanently dark region is not empty. It is not a wasteland. It contains more living space than every other habitat on Earth combined, more volume for life than all the rainforests and grasslands and deserts and shallow seas put together, several times over. Somewhere down there, right now, while you lie comfortable and warm and dry, there are creatures moving through that darkness who have never once experienced light, whose ancestors have never once experienced light, going back millions of generations, and who are nonetheless perfectly, completely adapted to the only world they have ever known, the way you are adapted to your ocean of air. We will meet some of them later. Not yet. For now, all I want you to hold is this gentle image, you, sinking slowly, weightlessly, through water that is growing steadily darker, steadily cooler, steadily quieter, the surface above you shrinking into a pale, wavering coin of light, and then, eventually, disappearing altogether. There is no need to hurry this descent. There is no bottom we need to reach tonight, no destination waiting with an alarm clock attached to it. We are simply going down, the way your own breathing is going down right now, a little slower with each exhale, a little heavier, a little less interested in holding on to anything at all. The pressure will begin to build as we go, just as it built in that ocean of air we started with, except this time we will actually be able to sense it, because water is nearly 800 times denser than air, and its weight accumulates far more quickly. But that is a story for a little further down, once we have left the light behind completely, once the temperature has dropped, once the last traces of the world you know from photographs and documentaries and sunlit vacations have quietly, gently, faded into the dark water above us. Let me begin with something worth understanding before we go any deeper, because it will make everything that follows easier to picture. When people say the oceans, plural, they are speaking a kind of comfortable fiction. There is really only one ocean. The Atlantic slides into the Southern Ocean, which slides into the Pacific, which slides into the Indian, which curls back up into the Arctic, and every drop of water in each of these so-called separate oceans is, given enough time, free to wander into any of the others. The names we use, Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, Southern, Arctic, are conveniences for mapmakers and sailors, boundaries drawn the way we draw lines between counties or time zones, useful for conversation but invisible to the water itself. If you were a single molecule of seawater, patient enough, you could in principle drift from the coast of Portugal, down past the tip of Africa, across the belt of water that circles Antarctica, up through the Pacific, and eventually find yourself somewhere off the coast of Japan, having never once crossed anything you could call a wall or a border, only open connected basin, one continuous body of water wrapping almost 3/4 of the surface of this planet. That is the first thing worth resting your mind on. Not separate oceans, but one ocean. An interconnected system of basins, trenches, ridges, and plains, all joined at the edges, the way rooms in a very large house are joined by open doorways rather than sealed with locked doors. Some rooms are shallow, sunlit, warm, crowded with life, the way a kitchen might be crowded with the business of a household during the day. Others are deep, cold, and dark, visited rarely, the way a basement might be visited only when something needs to be stored away or retrieved. But they are still rooms in the same house, still water in the same ocean. Now, the scale of this house, the average depth of the world ocean taken across all its basins, all its shallow shelves and towering ridges and abyssal plains, comes out to roughly 3.5 to 3.75 kilometers, something like 2 miles, give or take. That is the average. Picture, if it helps, stacking about 12 Empire State Buildings on top of each other, base to tip to base to tip, and that column of steel and stone would still not quite reach the ocean's average depth, let alone its deepest point. And that deepest point, so far as we have been able to measure it, lies in a place called the Challenger Deep, at the southern end of the Mariana Trench, in the western Pacific, not far from the island of Guam. Down there, the seafloor sits nearly 11 kilometers below the surface, close to 7 miles straight down. Mount Everest, dropped into that trench, would vanish beneath the waterline with more than a mile of ocean still sitting above its summit. It is worth pausing on the name for a moment, Challenger Deep, because it carries a small piece of human history worth knowing, told slowly, the way all good facts should be told at this hour. In the 1870s, a converted warship called HMS Challenger sailed the world's oceans for nearly 4 years, dropping weighted lines over the side, again and again, thousands of times, patiently measuring depth by how much rope it took before the weight finally touched bottom. It was slow, unglamorous work, sailors standing on deck in the cold, paying out line by hand, counting fathoms. And somewhere in the western Pacific, their lines told them the water there was unusually, remarkably deep. Decades later, when sonar replaced rope, when ships could send a sound pulse down and time its echo instead of lowering a physical line, that same patch of ocean was measured again, and again found to be the deepest place on Earth. The trench was named after that old ship and its patient crew, and it has kept the name ever since, even as our instruments have grown so much more precise than a length of hemp rope and a stopwatch. Only a handful of human beings have ever traveled all the way down to that specific point on the seafloor. In 1960, 2 men named Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh rowed a strange, bulbous vessel called the Trieste down to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. and descent that took nearly 5 hours, through utter blackness, the hull creaking under pressure the entire way. It would be more than 50 years before anyone returned. The filmmaker James Cameron went down alone in 2012 in a bright green submersible built almost like a vertical torpedo, and in the years since, a small number of others have followed, including an explorer named Victor Vescovo, who has now visited the deepest point of every ocean on Earth. Each of these journeys, spaced out across more than half a century, reminds us how recent, how rare, how genuinely difficult it still is for a human body to reach the deepest room in this enormous house of water. Easier, in some ways, to leave the planet entirely and orbit it from space than to sink to the very bottom of your own ocean. But you do not need a steel submersible tonight. You only need to keep sinking gently in your mind and to notice what changes as you go, because the changes are governed by a small handful of very simple physical rules, rules you already understand from ordinary life, even if you have never thought of them as ocean science. The first is light. Sunlight enters water and is absorbed, scattered, and swallowed, a little more with every meter of depth, the same way a flashlight beam grows dimmer and fuzzier the deeper you point it into a murky swimming pool. Red light, the longest wavelength, is absorbed first and fastest, disappearing within the first 10 meters or so, which is part of why a wound or a red buoy looks strangely brown or gray, even in fairly shallow water. Orange goes next, then yellow, then green, until by around 200 meters down, only a faint, deep blue remains, and by around 1,000 meters, even that blue has been swallowed entirely. This is why the ocean is loosely divided into zones, not by any wall or border, but by light itself. The sunlit zone near the top, where plants and light-dependent life can flourish. The twilight zone below it, dim, blue, where a little light still filters down, enough perhaps to make out shapes, but never to read a book by. And beneath that, the midnight zone, permanent and total darkness, stretching all the way to the seafloor, wherever that seafloor happens to lie. Temperature follows a similar pattern, though for a different reason. Near the surface, water is warmed by the sun and stirred by wind and waves into a fairly uniform layer, sometimes warm enough to swim in comfortably. But somewhere between roughly 100 and 1,000 meters down, depending on location and season, temperature drops fairly sharply. A transition layer called the thermocline, and below that the water settles into a cold, remarkably stable temperature, often only a few degrees above freezing, that holds steady across enormous stretches of the deep ocean, regardless of season or surface weather. It is, in its own way, one of the most stable climates on the entire planet, a place where the temperature you would feel tonight is very nearly the temperature that has sat there for thousands of years. Salinity, the saltiness of the water, behaves more subtly, shifting a little with rainfall, river input, evaporation, and the freezing and melting of polar ice. But it too tends to settle into fairly stable layers with depth. Water of one salinity resting gently above or below water of another, according to their differing densities, much the way oil and vinegar arrange themselves in a jar, only far more gradually and with far more layers involved. And pressure, the one you were promised earlier, builds the most reliably and predictably of them all. For every 10 meters you descend in seawater, the pressure increases by roughly 1 additional atmosphere, 1 full unit of the weight of air you feel right now, simply lying there breathing. By the time you reach the average depth of the ocean, you would be experiencing something like 350 times the pressure of the surface. By the bottom of the Challenger Deep, over 1,000 times. It is a steady, gentle, mathematical increase. the ocean quietly pressing inward from every direction as you sink, and it is that pressure, more than anything else, that will shape the strange and remarkable bodies of the creatures we are about to meet. Let's take that pressure with us now, and let it accompany us gently as we begin the actual descent, layer by layer, the way an oceanographer might describe it to a room of students, except here there is no room, only your own slow sinking imagination, and no need to stay awake for the lecture. The first layer, the one you already know without knowing its name, is called the sunlight zone, or if you prefer the more technical word, the epipelagic. It runs from the surface down to around 200 meters, though on a clear day in tropical water, useful sunlight can reach a little deeper, and on a cloudy day in silty coastal water, it may barely reach 50. This is the ocean of postcards, the layer where light still behaves the way light behaves in the world you know, where you can open your eyes underwater and make out shapes, colors, the silver flash of a fish turning in the current. It is also, not coincidentally, the only layer where plants and algae can grow, because photosynthesis needs sunlight the way a fire needs oxygen, and once the light fades below a certain threshold, that entire way of making a living simply stops working. Almost all of the ocean's visible, everyday life, the tuna and dolphins and sea turtles, the coral reefs, the seaweed forests, crowds into this thin, uppermost skin, which sounds like a great deal until you remember that this skin represents perhaps 2 or 3% of the ocean's total volume. Everything else, the overwhelming majority of the living space on this planet, lies beneath it, waiting. As you sink past 200 meters, something changes, not suddenly, but the way a room dims as clouds move across the sun. Red light disappears first, absorbed within the first few meters of any body of water, which is why blood looks black underwater, and why a diver's cut, seen at any real depth, shows no red at all. Orange goes next, then yellow, then green, until only blue remains, a deep, narrowing, almost jewel-like blue that grows dimmer and dimmer the further down you go, like the sky at the very end of a long summer evening, that particular shade just before the first stars come out. This is the twilight zone, the mesopelagic, stretching from roughly 200 meters down to 1,000, and its name could not be more fitting. There is still light here, technically, but not enough to read by, not enough to grow anything, not enough for your eyes to fully trust what they think they are seeing. In the 1930s, the naturalist William Beebe and his engineer partner Otis Barton descended into this exact layer off the coast of Bermuda inside a hollow steel ball called the bathysphere, barely large enough for the two of them to sit knee to knee, lowered on a single cable from a ship above. Beebe pressed his face to a fused quartz window and dictated what he saw through a telephone line back to the surface, describing colors and creatures that had never been recorded by a living human eye, his voice traveling up through hundreds of meters of cable, while his body sat suspended in a blue that, by his own account, seemed to grow bluer and lonelier the deeper they went. It was here, in this fading light, that biologists first confirmed something remarkable, that a great many of the creatures living in the twilight zone spend their days down in the dimness, and then rise, every single night, hundreds of meters toward the surface to feed, before sinking back down again before dawn. This nightly commute, now called the Deal vertical migration, involves so many billions of small fish and shrimp-like creatures moving in unison that early researchers using sonar mistook it for a second seafloor, a false bottom that seemed to rise and fall with the sun, and it remains, by sheer number of bodies in motion, thought to be the largest synchronized movement of animal life on Earth, repeating itself every single night in near total silence. Beyond 1,000 meters, the last blue finally gives out, and true darkness begins. The kind of darkness that has nothing to do with closing your eyes, because closing your eyes changes nothing about what is already there. This is the midnight zone, or bathypelagic, running from 1,000 meters down to about 4,000, and if the twilight zone felt lonely, this one is deeper, quieter, colder still. No sunlight reaches here at all, not a trace, which means the only light in this entire layer comes from the animals themselves, small chemical flashes and glows produced by creatures who have, in a sense, learned to carry their own tiny lanterns since the universe declined to provide any. We will spend real time later with these lights and the strange lives that produce them, but for now it is enough to simply picture it, an absolute blackness pressing in from every direction, occasionally interrupted by a blue-green flicker, there and then gone, like a single firefly in a cave the size of a continent. The water here has grown properly cold by now, hovering just a few degrees above freezing, and the pressure has climbed to hundreds of times what you feel lying still tonight, though as you already know, nothing down here experiences that pressure as any kind of burden, only as the ordinary condition of being alive. Somewhere around 4,000 meters, the water column gives way to something more solid, and we arrive at the abyssal zone, the abyssopelagic, which extends from about 4,000 meters down to 6,000 and covers, more than any other single layer, the actual floor of most of the world's oceans. Picture, if you can, vast rolling plains, not jagged or dramatic, but soft and gently undulating, blanketed in a fine pale sediment sometimes centimeters thick, made up of the slowly accumulated remains of countless small creatures that lived and died in the sunlit water far above and drifted downward for years, sometimes decades, before finally settling here. This sediment is often called marine snow, and the comparison is apt. A slow, continuous, silent snowfall that has been falling, without pause, for longer than there have been humans to imagine it. The abyssal plains are among the flattest, most featureless landscapes on the entire planet, flatter than most deserts, flatter than the widest prairies, disturbed only occasionally by the track of a sea cucumber inching across the mud or the shallow depression left by something that passed through days or weeks earlier and has long since moved on. It is a landscape built almost entirely out of patience. And then, in certain specific places, the ocean floor does something unexpected. It doesn't simply flatten out and stay flat. It drops again, plunging into narrow, steep-walled trenches formed where one of the great plates of the Earth's crust slides slowly beneath another, and these trenches make up the fifth and final layer, the Hadal Zone, named for Hades, the old underworld, which tells you something about how 19th and 20th century scientists felt about this place before they had ever truly seen it. The Hadal Zone begins around 6,000 meters, and, in a small number of trenches scattered around the Pacific in particular, continues down past 10,000, all the way to the deepest known point on the planet, the Challenger Deep, within the Mariana Trench, first properly measured by the crew of the British survey ship HMS Challenger in the 1870s, and not visited by any human being until 1960. When Auguste Piccard's son, Jacques, and the American naval officer Don Walsh descended nearly 11,000 meters inside a steel vessel called the Bathyscaphe Trieste, sitting inside a pressure sphere with walls over 12 centimeters thick, watching, through a small window that cracked on the way down, a landscape almost no one before them had any real evidence even existed. These trenches are narrow, isolated from one another, more like a scattering of deep wells than one continuous floor, and life down there, as we'll come to see, has had to adapt to conditions found almost nowhere else on Earth. It's worth pausing here, gently, before going further, to remember that none of these 5 names, sunlight, twilight, midnight, abyssal, hadal, describe a wall. They describe a gradient, a slow and continuous shift, and the animals who live within it rarely respect the tidy lines humans have drawn on a chart. Some drift up and down across 2 or 3 of these zones in a single day. Some spend their larval stage in one layer entirely and their adult life in another. The ocean, as you're about to find, was arranged by physics and chemistry long before anyone arrived to name its rooms, and it has never much cared for the boundaries we've since drawn around them. So let's move gently into that darkness itself, because once you drop below the twilight zone, somewhere around 1,000 meters, sunlight simply stops, not dims further, not fades to some fainter version of blue, stops. The last photon that could plausibly support photosynthesis has already been absorbed, scattered, or swallowed by water molecules and the particles drifting between them, and everything below that point exists in a darkness so complete that if you held your hand an inch from your own eyes down there, you would not see it. This is the condition the vast majority of life on Earth, by volume, has to solve for. Not extreme cold, though it is cold. Not crushing pressure, though the pressure is real, and we'll come to it. Darkness, first and foremost, because darkness rewrites almost every assumption an animal might otherwise carry from the sunlit world about how to eat, how to find a mate, how to avoid being eaten, and how to simply keep a body running from one day to the next. One of the strangest and, I think, most quietly beautiful answers to this problem is that many of these animals make their own light. Bioluminescence, the production of light through a chemical reaction inside a living creature, was not invented once and passed down through a single family tree. It appears to have evolved dozens of separate times, independently, in fish and squid and jellyfish and worms, and even certain bacteria, which suggests that when the pressure is strong enough, when darkness is total and permanent enough, evolution keeps arriving at the same basic solution simply because it works so well. The chemistry itself is fairly consistent across many of these creatures. A molecule called luciferin reacts with oxygen, often with the help of an enzyme called luciferase, and the reaction releases energy as light rather than as heat, which is remarkable if you think about it, because nearly every other way we know of making light, a candle, a bulb, a fire, wastes most of its energy as warmth. A firefly on a summer evening and an anglerfish half a mile down are, chemically speaking, distant cousins in this one narrow sense, both converting stored energy directly into cold light, with almost none lost along the way. But bioluminescence in the deep sea is used for far more purposes than a firefly's simple summer signal. Some animals use it as a lure, the way the anglerfish famously does, a glowing filament dangled in front of a mouth full of needle-thin teeth, waiting patiently, sometimes for what researchers believe may be weeks at a stretch, for something curious or hungry enough to swim close. Some use it defensively instead, a sudden bright flash meant to startle a predator, or a puff of glowing chemical released into the water like a squid's ink, except, instead of hiding the escaping animal, it lights up the space it just fled, a kind of decoy made of light rather than shadow. And some use light for camouflage, in a strategy called counter-illumination, which still strikes me as one of the more elegant tricks in all of biology. An animal near the upper edge of the dark zone, looking upward, will always see a very faint gray glow from the sunlight still filtering down from far above. A predator swimming beneath its prey, looking up, would normally see that prey as a solid, dark silhouette against that gray glow, an easy target. So certain fish and squid have light-producing organs on their undersides, and they tune the intensity of that glow to match the faint light coming from above, effectively erasing their own outline. They are, in a sense, matching a shadow to a background so precisely that the shadow disappears. The eyes, built to notice all of this light, or the absence of it, take on strange and specific forms the deeper you travel. In the twilight zone, where a small amount of dim blue light still exists, many animals have unusually large eyes, sometimes strikingly out of proportion to the rest of their bodies, built to gather every last available photon, the biological equivalent of a wide, light-hungry camera lens. The deep-sea hatchetfish is a good example. Its eyes so large and so oddly shaped that its whole skull seems built around them, but go deeper still, into the true dark of the midnight and abyssal zones, where there is no ambient light left to gather at all, and you find the opposite adjustment. Some animals there have reduced eyes, small and simple, or in certain cases no eyes whatsoever, because building and maintaining a complex eye costs the body real energy, and there is no return on that investment when there is nothing left to see with it. Instead, many of these creatures lean on other senses entirely. Elaborate systems of touch and vibration and chemical detection, feeling the water move around them, tasting faint chemical trails, sensing the pressure changes made by another creature swimming nearby, the way you might sense someone walking past you in a dark room, not by seeing them, but by feeling the air shift. Food itself is scarce down there, and scarcity shapes bodies as surely as darkness does. In the sunlit surface waters, food is, relatively speaking, abundant and predictable, arriving fresh with the daily cycle of photosynthesis. In the deep sea, most food arrives as what oceanographers rather plainly call marine snow, a slow, continuous drift of organic particles sinking down from far above, dead plankton, shed skin cells, fecal pellets, tiny fragments of decaying material, all settling downward over days or weeks like flakes falling through still air. It is real food, but it is thin and unreliable, and a very large meal, an actual carcass, a whale fall, a fish that has died and is sinking, might not arrive again for a long stretch of time. So many deep-sea animals have adjusted their whole metabolism around this uncertainty, slowing themselves down in a very deliberate, very effective way. Their bodies burn energy at a far lower rate than a similar animal near the surface. Their movements are often slower and more economical, and many species have evolved the capacity to go a remarkably long time between meals, some for what researchers estimate could be months, built almost like a savings account for calories, rather than a checking account that needs constant refilling. That same economy of energy shapes the very structure of many deep-sea bodies. Building and maintaining a heavy skeleton, thick, dense muscle, a rigid shell, all of it costs energy, and in a place where energy is precious and pressure from above is immense, many animals have instead evolved soft, gelatinous, almost weightless bodies, jellyfish and comb jellies, and certain squid, bodies made mostly of water, buoyant without needing much muscle at all to stay suspended, cheap to build and cheap to keep. Some go further still and become nearly transparent, their tissues so thin and so evenly matched in density to the surrounding water that light passes almost straight through them, leaving very little for a predator's eye, however large or sensitive, to actually catch and register. It is, in its own way, a second and quieter form of the same trick as counter-illumination, rather than matching the light, simply refusing to interrupt it at all. Every one of these adaptations, the living light, the outsized or vanished eyes, the slowed metabolism, the soft, transparent bodies, comes bundled with a trade-off, because nothing here is free. A body built for extreme economy is rarely built for speed. So many deep-sea predators must rely on ambush and patience rather than pursuit, a lure that draws in prey can just as easily draw in something larger and hungrier than the lure's owner ever intended to attract. And a body invisible to a predator's eye is, for exactly the same reason, invisible to a potential mate in a place already so sparsely populated that finding another member of your own species, at all, is its own quiet and considerable challenge, which is where some genuinely strange solutions to the problem of meeting another living creature in all that darkness begin to come into view. Before following that thread of courtship in the dark any further, it helps to sink down one more layer, past the drifting lights and the lantern eyes, down to the surface that all of it settles onto in the end. Because for all the strangeness swimming through the middle depths, most of the deep ocean, by far, is not swimming at all. It is lying still, at the very bottom, on a landscape that took humans a surprisingly long time to even begin to see. For most of history, the seafloor was simply unknown, a blank the color of ink on every map, and sailors who thought about it at all mostly imagined it as a smooth, featureless bowl, gently curving down from every shoreline to some single uniform deep. It took the voyage of HMS Challenger, a converted warship sent out by the British Navy in 1872, to start correcting that picture, one weighted rope at a time. Sailors on that ship spent 4 years dropping lines, sometimes miles of them, over the side, waiting for a weight to hit bottom, then hauling all that rope back up by hand to read off the depth. It was slow, exhausting work, and it covered only a few hundred scattered points across the entire planet's oceans, but it was enough to reveal that the bottom was not flat and was not uniform. Some spots were shockingly deep. Others rose up steeply from nearby depths. The seafloor, it turned out, had a shape. The real picture didn't come into focus until the technology caught up, decades later, with sound. Echo sounders, developed in the early 20th century and refined heavily during and after the 2 world wars, let ships send a short pulse of sound down into the water and time how long it took to bounce back off the bottom. Sound travels through seawater at a fairly predictable speed, so that travel time, once you know it, converts almost directly into depth. Ships could now trace continuous profiles of the seafloor as they steamed along, instead of collecting single isolated points, one exhausting rope length at a time. And once enough of those profiles existed, side by side, patterns started to emerge that no one sailing a single ship along a single line could ever have noticed on their own. It was a geologist named Marie Tharp, working in the 1950s, who did more than almost anyone to turn those scattered soundings into an actual map. She was not allowed on the research ships that collected much of the data, since women were barred from those voyages at the time, so she worked from an office, drawing profile after profile by hand from the numbers her colleagues brought back, plotting depth against position until a shape began to reveal itself, again and again, running down the middle of the Atlantic. A long mountain range, thousands of miles from end to end, rising up from the plain on either side, with a narrow valley running down its center like a seam. She and her colleague Bruce Heezen recognized what they were looking at as a mid-ocean ridge, and further, that the valley running down its spine looked very much like a rift, a place where the seafloor itself was being pulled apart. That idea connected almost immediately to a theory that had been circling for decades without solid proof, the idea that continents drift, and it helped turn that theory from a mostly rejected curiosity into what would eventually become plate tectonics, one of the great unifying ideas in all of Earth science. The mid-ocean ridge itself, once you understand what it is, becomes a kind of anchor for picturing the whole seafloor. Molten rock rises up along that central rift, cools into new ocean crust, and pushes the older crust away on either side, slowly, at roughly the speed a fingernail grows. That means the seafloor closest to the ridge is, geologically speaking, young, while seafloor farther away, closer to the edges of ocean basins, is far older, having had much more time to drift and to accumulate a slow blanket of settling material on top of it. That settling material has a name almost too gentle for how important it is: marine snow. It is not snow in any cold or crystalline sense, but the comparison holds up surprisingly well once you picture it. It is a slow, near-constant drift of tiny particles falling from the sunlit water far above, made of dead plankton, fragments of shed skin and shell, flakes of waste, sticky little clumps of organic matter that have gathered other organic matter around them on the way down, all sinking so slowly, often less than 100 meters a day, that many pieces take weeks to reach the very bottom. Along the way, some of it gets intercepted and eaten by drifting animals in the water column. What survives that gauntlet keeps falling, silently, endlessly, and settles onto the seafloor as a very fine, easily disturbed layer of sediment, mixed in with mineral dust blown out from continents and volcanic ash, and, over vast stretches of time, the tiny mineral shells of long-dead microscopic organisms. Where this settling happens over millions of years, undisturbed by strong currents, it builds up the largest and least dramatic landform on the entire planet, the abyssal plain. These plains stretch across enormous portions of every ocean basin, remarkably flat, more level in places than almost any landscape found on the continents above, since the constant gentle rain of marine snow smooths out irregularities, the way dust settling in an unused room slowly softens every hard edge into the same neutral texture. Walking across one, if such a thing were possible, would feel less like crossing a seafloor and more like crossing a floor made of the softest imaginable flour. Sediment so fine and so loosely packed that a footprint left there could plausibly last far longer than a footprint left in packed dirt or sand above the waves, since almost nothing down there disturbs it. But the seafloor is far from uniformly flat, and the plains are only one part of the story. Rising abruptly out of those plains, sometimes by the thousands, are seamounts, underwater volcanoes, most long extinct, some still active, built up over millions of years from repeated eruptions the same way a candle slowly builds a cone of dripped wax. Many never reach the surface at all and remain fully submerged mountains, some taller than anything found on land. A few grow tall enough to become islands, at least for a while, and a strange further fate some of those. As ocean crust cools and slowly sinks over millions of years, and as erosion and wave action wear down whatever once stood above the waterline, some islands sink back beneath the surface entirely, leaving behind a flat-topped underwater mountain called a guyot, a kind of geological gravestone for an island that no longer exists. Where two plates come together instead of pulling apart, the seafloor tells an entirely different story. Instead of ridges and rifts, you find trenches, long, narrow gashes where one plate is forced to bend downward and slide beneath another, plunging into the Earth's interior in a process called subduction. These trenches hold the single deepest points in any ocean, deeper by a considerable margin than the height of the tallest mountains on land, and walking down into one, if such a walk were possible, would mean descending far longer than climbing any peak above the waves would take to ascend. Some of the seafloor's other most dramatic features, meanwhile, are canyons, carved not by rivers of water, but by rivers of sediment, fast-moving underwater avalanches called turbidity currents, dense clouds of stirred-up mud and sand and silt that flow downhill along the seafloor with real force, cutting channels into the continental slope over time in something like a slow-motion echo of how a river above the waves cuts its own canyon into rock and soil. All of this, the plains and the ridges, the seamounts and the trenches, the canyons, and that endless gentle fall of marine snow settling over everything else, forms a landscape every bit as varied as anything found above the waterline, just built more slowly, and largely without light to reveal its shape until quite recently in human history. And scattered across that landscape, in a few very particular places, that same slow, patient darkness is interrupted by something almost nobody expected to find down there at all. In the summer of 1977, a small research submersible called Alvin descended toward the Galapagos Rift, a stretch of mid-ocean ridge nearly 1.5 miles beneath the eastern Pacific, on a mission that had nothing to do with biology at all. The scientists aboard were geologists and geochemists, there to study the rocks and the heat flowing up through newly formed ocean crust, the same spreading centers described a moment ago, where two plates pull apart and fresh seafloor is born. What they did not expect, as Alvin's lights swept across the volcanic rubble of the Rift Valley floor, was to find it crowded with life. Clusters of white clams the size of dinner plates, thickets of what looked almost like pale, feathery flowers, standing several feet tall, swaying gently in the shimmering water, crabs picking their way across ground, warm enough to keep the surrounding water measurably hotter than anything nearby. The scientists were so unprepared for this that the ship carried no biologists at all, and no proper jars for preserving specimens, so the crew reportedly improvised, using whatever containers they had on hand, including, as the story is often told, a vodka bottle from the ship's stores, to bring the first samples back to the surface. It remains one of the great accidental discoveries in the history of ocean science, and it rewrote, almost overnight, what biologists thought they understood about where life could exist and what it needed to get by. What Alvin had found was a hydrothermal vent, a place where seawater seeps down through cracks in newly formed crust, sinks deep enough to come into contact with hot rock near a magma chamber, and gets heated dramatically, sometimes to several hundred degrees Celsius, before rushing back up through the seafloor under pressure. Along the way, that superheated water dissolves minerals out of the surrounding rock, and picks up dissolved gases as well, particularly hydrogen sulfide, the same compound responsible for the smell of rotten eggs, though down at the vent there is no smell at all, only chemistry happening in darkness and cold that briefly becomes extraordinary heat. When this mineral-rich water gushes back out into the near-freezing water of the deep ocean, the sudden temperature change causes dissolved metals to precipitate almost instantly, turning solid, and at some vents this creates plumes of what look remarkably like black smoke pouring from natural chimneys built up, layer by layer, out of the very minerals the water carried. These are called black smokers, and some of the chimneys they build over years and decades can rise many stories tall as a several-story building, before eventually toppling under their own weight or being buried by a fresh volcanic flow. None of that, on its own, explains the crowded, thriving communities Alvin found. The deep ocean, as earlier sections of this journey have described, is normally a place of scarcity, where nearly everything alive depends, directly or indirectly, on a thin trickle of marine snow falling from the sunlit water far above. It has its own local energy source, welling up from below, and the organisms living there have found a way to use it that has nothing to do with sunlight at all. The key to that trick is a process called chemosynthesis, and it's worth taking a slow moment to understand how it actually works, because it's genuinely one of the more remarkable tricks life has ever discovered. Ordinary photosynthesis, the kind performed by plants and algae and the phytoplankton discussed earlier, works by capturing energy from sunlight and using that energy to build sugar molecules out of carbon dioxide and water, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. It is, in a sense, energy borrowed from the sun and stored in chemical form. Chemosynthesis does something structurally similar, but starts from an entirely different source of energy. Certain specialized bacteria and other microbes, instead of harvesting light, harvest the energy released when they chemically react hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg compound streaming from the vent, with oxygen dissolved in the surrounding seawater. That reaction releases usable energy, in roughly the same way that burning releases energy, though of course much more slowly and controllably, and the microbes use that energy to do the same fundamental job photosynthetic organisms do, build sugars and other organic molecules out of carbon dioxide, creating food, essentially, out of raw chemistry and the dark. It is a genuinely separate answer to one of the oldest questions in biology, the question of how to get life-sustaining energy out of an indifferent environment, and vent ecosystems are one of the very few places on Earth where that alternative answer is not just possible in theory, but forms the actual base of an entire food web. Once you understand that the microbes are the foundation, the rest of the community starts to make a different kind of sense, because almost nothing at a vent eats those microbes in the ordinary way, by grazing on them directly, the way a deer eats grass. Instead, many of the larger vent animals have entered into partnerships with the bacteria, housing them inside their own bodies, and letting the microbes do the chemical work internally, in a relationship biologists call symbiosis, where both partners benefit from staying close. The most striking example is the giant tube worm, sometimes called Riftia, those pale swaying columns that first caught Alvin's lights in 1977, that can grow to be taller than a person over the course of just a few years despite living in total darkness. A tube worm has no mouth and no digestive system at all, having lost them entirely somewhere in its evolutionary history, because it doesn't need them. Instead, its body is packed with a specialized internal organ absolutely full of chemosynthetic bacteria, and a bright red plume at its top, colored red by a blood pigment not unlike hemoglobin, reaches out into the vent water to absorb hydrogen sulfide and oxygen and carry them inward to feed its resident microbes, which in turn feed the worm with the sugars they produce. It is a complete, self-contained chemical farm, worn on the inside of the body instead of tended outside it. Around the tube worms cluster the rest of the vent community, each finding its own way to make use of that same underlying chemistry. Vent clams and mussels host similar symbiotic bacteria in their gills, filtering vent water directly across the surfaces where their microbial partners live. Eyeless shrimp swarm in some vent fields by the thousands, so densely packed that early researchers sometimes describe the seafloor as looking as though it were covered in a moving carpet. And these shrimp appear to farm bacteria growing directly on their own bodies, scraping it off and eating it, while sensing the faint glow of vent heat with light-sensitive patches on their backs in place of proper eyes, since there is nothing else worth seeing down there in the ordinary sense. Pale crabs scavenge among the mussel beds, and at some vent sites, a peculiar, densely furred crustacean, now nicknamed the Yeti crab, was found waving its bristled claws in the mineral-laden water, those bristles themselves hosting yet more chemosynthetic bacteria that the crab may harvest as food. Around the edges of the community, fish and octopuses arrive as predators, drawn in by a food supply that, however strange its origin, is genuinely abundant in a way almost nothing else in the deep sea is. Vents are not the only place this chemistry unfolds. Not far away, geologically speaking, in places without any volcanic heat at all, methane and hydrogen sulfide sometimes seep slowly up through seafloor sediment from ancient buried deposits below, cold and unhurried compared to a vent's violent plumbing, in what are called cold seeps. The water there is no warmer than its surroundings, sometimes barely distinguishable from it at all, but the chemistry seeping up is enough, and cold seeps host their own communities, built on the very same principle, tube worms and clams and bacterial mats living slow, long lives. Some tube worms at cold seeps estimated to persist for centuries, patiently drawing energy out of a planet that, it turns out, offers far more than one way to keep the lights on in the dark. Move away from the vents and seeps, out into the open blackness that makes up most of the deep ocean, and you meet the animals that people actually picture when they hear the words deep sea, the ones that show up in documentaries and nightmares alike. And it's worth being honest from the outset about how much of what we think we know about them comes from a small number of sightings stretched thin over a very large ocean. Start with the anglerfish, since it is probably the single most recognizable deep-sea animal there is, that spine-like lure jutting forward from its head with a soft, glowing tip, dangled in front of an enormous, backward-hinged jaw. The glow comes from bioluminescent bacteria housed in a special organ at the lure's tip, and the fish appears to be able to control the light to some degree, flicking it on and off to imitate the movement of a small, edible creature. Anything curious enough to investigate finds itself very quickly inside a mouth built almost entirely around the idea of not letting prey escape once caught. Teeth angled backward like a one-way door. What often gets exaggerated is the ferocity of the thing. In popular imagination, the anglerfish is drawn as some relentless predator on the prowl, but by all available evidence, it is closer to the opposite. A slow, largely stationary ambush hunter that expends as little energy as possible and simply waits, sometimes for what researchers suspect could be very long stretches, for something to swim close enough to the light. One genuinely strange and well-documented detail is the mating system in many anglerfish species, where the tiny male, far smaller than the female, and equipped with almost nothing but the sense organs needed to find her by scent, bites onto her body and gradually fuses to it, their skin, and eventually their blood vessels merging until he becomes a permanent, parasitic attachment, feeding off her bloodstream and providing sperm on demand for the rest of her life. It sounds like something invented for shock value, but it is simply a documented reproductive strategy, one plausible solution to the very real problem of finding a mate in an ocean where individuals are spread thin across enormous volumes of empty water. The giant squid occupies a strange position in this story, because for most of human history, it was known only through myth before it was known through science, and the two versions of the animal have never fully separated in the public mind. Sailors described sea monsters with reaching arms capable of pulling ships under, and Scandinavian legend gave the creature a name, the kraken, long before anyone had reliable evidence such an animal existed at all. What sailors were very likely encountering, at least at times, were genuine giant squid, real animals that can grow to lengths of over 12 meters, including their long feeding tentacles, with eyes among the largest in the animal kingdom, roughly the size of a dinner plate, an adaptation that seems to help them detect the faint approach of their one major predator, the sperm whale, in water too dark for almost anything else to see by. For well over a century, everything known about giant squid came from dead specimens washed ashore or pulled up in fishing nets, sometimes badly damaged, and from the telltale sucker scars found on the skin of sperm whales that had clearly done battle with something enormous. It was not until 2004 that anyone captured images of a live giant squid in its natural habitat, and not until 2012 that one was filmed on camera in the deep sea itself. Footage that confirmed the animal was real, was roughly as large as reported, and behaved, as far as could be told from limited observation, less like a monster and more like an enormous, slow-drifting predator going about its business far from any ship. The vampire squid causes confusion of a different kind, mostly because of its name. It is not a squid at all in the strict sense, but a member of its own separate small order, and despite the alarming name, it does not drink blood or attack anything larger than itself. The name comes from its appearance, a dark, reddish-black body with a webbing of skin connecting its arms that it can pull up and over itself like a cloak, along with eyes that are enormous relative to its small body, giving it a genuinely startling look under a camera light, even though its actual behavior is almost the opposite of predatory. It survives mostly on marine snow and the debris left behind by other animals, using a pair of retractable filaments to gather loose particles from the water rather than chasing anything down, and it lives in one of the most oxygen-poor layers of the ocean, a zone many other animals avoid entirely, getting by on a slowed metabolism that seems built for exactly this kind of quiet, low-energy existence. Gulper eels present a body plan that looks almost like a design error, if you didn't already know better. An enormous, loosely hinged mouth, attached to a long, thin, whip-like tail, with a stomach capable of stretching to accommodate prey considerably larger than the eel's own head. The logic behind this is the same logic that shapes so much of deep-sea life. An animal that may go a very long time between meals cannot afford to pass one up on the grounds that it looks too big to manage. And a stomach that can expand dramatically means the eel is never forced to make that choice. Some gulper eels also carry a small light-producing organ at the tip of their tail, and it has been suggested, though not conclusively confirmed, that this glow might serve to lure prey toward the business end of the animal entirely, using the tail as a kind of decoy pointed the wrong way. Jellyfish, or more precisely, the whole loose category of gelatinous animals that includes true jellyfish, comb jellies, and siphonophores, turn out to be far more common and far more varied in the deep sea than older surveys ever suggested, something researchers have only really appreciated since deep-diving cameras became common enough to watch them undisturbed rather than hauling them up in nets that destroyed their fragile bodies before anyone could see what they actually looked like alive. Some produce their own light in shifting, rippling patterns along their bodies. Others, like the giant siphonophores, are not single animals at all, but colonies of thousands of specialized, genetically identical individuals working together, some built for stinging, others for digestion, others for propulsion, forming chains that in a few known cases stretch longer than a blue whale. And the deep sea is not only home to permanent residents. Sperm whales and several species of beaked whale are known to dive to extraordinary depths in search of squid, with sperm whales regularly reaching 1,000 meters or more and staying down for the better part of an hour on a single breath, their bodies modified for the trip with collapsible rib cages, blood chemistry tuned to store oxygen efficiently, and a tolerance for pressure and nitrogen buildup that would be lethal to a human diver attempting anything close to the same depth. Down among the pressure-adapted fish that never leave these depths at all, cell membranes and proteins have been chemically reshaped over evolutionary time to keep functioning normally under crushing pressure that would deform or disable the equivalent molecules in a shallow water fish, a kind of adaptation too slow and too invisible to photograph, but every bit as real as a glowing lure or an oversized eye. It's worth sitting with how differently these animals solve the same basic set of problems: darkness, scarcity, and pressure, because the variety of solutions is itself the more remarkable thing, more remarkable, in its own quiet way, than any single monster from an old sailor's story. None of this, the light patterns, the colonial siphonophores, the pressure-reshaped proteins in a fish that will never see the surface of the water it lives in, was known to anyone for most of human history. For thousands of years, the deep ocean was simply absent from human knowledge. Not mysterious so much as unconsidered, a blank space beneath the working surface of the sea, where people fished, sailed, and occasionally drowned. The story of how that blank space slowly filled in with detail is its own kind of adventure, and it helps to walk through it slowly, because almost everything we've spent the last several hours describing was learned within the lifetime of somebody's great-grandparent. The earliest method for finding out anything about the deep sea was about as simple as a technology can be. Sailors would lower a weighted line over the side of a ship, let it sink, and measure how much rope paid out before the weight touched bottom. This was called sounding, and for centuries it was almost the only tool available for guessing at the shape of the ocean floor. It worked well enough in shallow coastal water, where a sailor needed to know if there was enough depth to avoid running the ship aground. But in the open ocean, dropping a hand line thousands of meters down, waiting for it to reach bottom, then hauling all that rope back up by hand, was slow, exhausting work and prone to error, since the line could drift sideways in a current and give a false reading, suggesting water was deeper than it actually was. For a long time, this was simply accepted as the limit of what could be known. The deep sea was, by definition, the part of the ocean nobody could measure well. That began to change in the 1870s, with a British Royal Navy vessel called the HMS Challenger. The Challenger expedition, which ran from 1872 to 1876, is often treated as the true beginning of oceanography as a science, and it earned that reputation through sheer persistence rather than any single dramatic discovery. The ship's crew and scientists spent nearly 4 years circling the globe, stopping regularly to take soundings, dredge the seafloor for samples, measure water temperature at different depths, and collect specimens of whatever strange animals came up in their nets, many of them completely unknown to science, arriving on deck in states of injury from the drastic pressure change, which made it hard for anyone to guess what they'd looked like alive. The ship's crew took hundreds of deep soundings, using improved machinery that could handle the rope and wire more efficiently than a hand line, and in doing so, they measured, among other things, an extraordinary depth in the Western Pacific, in the very trench that would later be named after the ship itself, the Mariana Trench, home to the deepest known point in any ocean on Earth. The Challenger expedition produced so much data and so many specimens that it took scientists decades after the ship returned home just to catalog and describe everything they'd collected. In a real sense, oceanography as an organized field of study grew directly out of the paperwork generated by one very long voyage. Measuring the deep sea from above the water, though, only tells you so much. It can tell you how deep the water is, and, if you're lucky, what falls into a net dragged along the bottom. It cannot tell you what the seafloor actually looks like, or how an animal moves, or what a hydrothermal vent sounds like, if sound is even the right word for it. For that, someone eventually had to go down and look, which meant solving an entirely different problem: how to build something that a person could survive inside at crushing depth. The first real answer to that problem came in the early 1930s from an American naturalist named William Beebe and an engineer named Otis Barton, who together designed a hollow steel sphere just large enough for 2 people to fold themselves into, with thick quartz windows and a cable connecting it to a ship on the surface. They called it the bathysphere, and in 1934, off the coast of Bermuda, Beebe and Barton were lowered inside it to a depth of nearly 1,000 meters, becoming the first human beings to see the deep sea with their own eyes rather than through the second-hand evidence of a net or a sounding line. Beebe described what he saw through the small round window in real time, over a telephone line back to the surface, narrating fish and lights and colors to a stenographer typing it all down, since there was no way yet to bring a camera capable of recording any of it. It's a strange thing to picture now, a man curled inside a steel ball at the bottom of the ocean, describing bioluminescent animals aloud to someone above him scribbling in a notebook, because it was the only way anyone else would ever know what he'd seen. The bathysphere, for all its historic importance, was tethered to its ship and couldn't move on its own, which limited how much of the deep sea it could actually explore. The next major leap came a couple of decades later with the invention of the bathyscaphe, a self-propelled diving vessel designed by the Swiss physicist Auguste Piccard, who had already made a name for himself designing balloons for high-altitude flight, and simply applied similar principles in reverse, using a large tank of gasoline for buoyancy instead of a cable for support. In 1960, Auguste's son, Jacques Piccard, along with a U.S. Navy lieutenant named Don Walsh, piloted a bathyscaphe called the Trieste down into the Mariana Trench itself, reaching a depth of nearly 11 kilometers, close to the deepest point on the entire planet. The descent took almost 5 hours. Near the bottom, one of the outer window panes actually cracked from the pressure, though it held, and the two men spent only about 20 minutes at the bottom before beginning the long ascent, limited by little visibility, since their own movement had stirred up a cloud of fine sediment. Still, for decades afterward, theirs remained the only crewed visit to the deepest place in the ocean, a record that stood essentially untouched until private expeditions revisited the trench many decades later. Through the 1960s and 70s, deep-sea vehicles kept improving, most famously with a small research submersible named Alvin, built for the United States and still in operation today after multiple rebuilds and depth upgrades. Alvin has had an unusually storied career, at one point helping to locate a hydrogen bomb lost in the Mediterranean after a mid-air collision, and later, in 1977, carrying scientists down to the Galapagos Rift, where they became the first humans to witness hydrothermal vents and the strange, chemically fueled communities of life clustered around them, a discovery that upended assumptions about what kinds of energy could support life at all. Alvin would go on, years later, to help explore and document the wreck of the Titanic, extending the same technology built for scientific discovery into one of the most famous human stories of the 20th century. Crewed submersibles, though, are expensive, slow to build, and inherently limited by the fact that they need to keep a human being alive and comfortable, which adds weight, complexity, and risk to every dive. Starting in the latter half of the 20th century, engineers increasingly turned to remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, unmanned robots connected to a ship by a long tether, carrying cameras, lights, and mechanical arms, controlled by a pilot sitting safely on the surface watching a video feed. ROVs could stay down far longer than any human crew, dive repeatedly without the same physiological risk, and go to depths that would be far riskier to attempt with people aboard. Alongside them came autonomous underwater vehicles, robots that carry no tether at all and instead follow pre-programmed paths, mapping the seafloor or searching for specific features and only reporting back once they resurface. And running underneath nearly all of this modern work is sonar, using sound waves rather than light to build a picture of what lies below, since sound travels through water far more efficiently than light ever could. All of this technology, the submersibles and the robots and the sound waves bouncing patiently through the dark, eventually pointed toward one particular kind of place that seemed almost designed to test the limits of what any of it could do. If you were to drain the ocean away entirely and look at the bare bones of the seafloor the way you might look at a skeleton, you would notice that the deepest scars on the planet are not out in the middle of the open plains of the abyss, but along certain curved lines near the edges of continents and island chains. These are the ocean trenches, and they are, in a very real sense, wounds in the crust of the earth, though wounds that have been forming and healing and forming again for tens of millions of years. To understand why they exist at all, it helps to remember something that took scientists a surprisingly long time to accept, which is that the continents and ocean floors are not fixed in place, but instead ride along on a small number of enormous plates, slabs of rock perhaps 60 or 70 miles thick, drifting across the planet's surface at a pace not much different from the speed your fingernails grow. Where two of these plates spread apart, magma rises up to fill the gap, cools, and creates new seafloor, which is part of why the mid-ocean ridges we've already wandered through exist. But plates cannot simply keep being created forever without something else happening somewhere else to balance the books, since the planet itself is not expanding. And so, in certain places, old, cold, dense seafloor plunges back down into the Earth's interior, sliding beneath a neighboring plate in a process geologists call subduction. A trench is the visible mark of that process, the long, narrow furrow that forms exactly where one plate begins its descent under another, like the crease that appears in a rug when you push one section of it under the edge of another. This single, quiet mechanism turns out to explain an enormous amount about the more dramatic parts of our planet's behavior. As the descending plate is forced downward, it doesn't move smoothly the way a marble might slide down a chute. It catches, it sticks, tension builds along the boundary for years or decades or centuries, and then, all at once, it slips, releasing that stored energy in a matter of seconds. This is why so many of the largest earthquakes in recorded history have occurred near trenches, including the 1960 earthquake off the coast of Chile, still the most powerful ever measured by modern instruments, and the 2011 earthquake off the coast of Japan, which occurred along the subduction zone associated with the Japan Trench and triggered a tsunami that reshaped in the space of a single afternoon how much of the world thought about coastal safety. The same friction and slippage that carves these deep scars into the ocean floor is the same friction and slippage that shakes cities built along the coastlines above them, sometimes thousands of miles away from where the trench itself lies hidden under dark water. Trenches also turn out to be central to a much slower, much quieter story, one involving the long-term recycling of carbon through the planet. Marine organisms, from the tiniest plankton to larger creatures, build shells and skeletons using carbon drawn from seawater, and when they die, much of that material drifts down and eventually becomes part of the sediment layered across the ocean floor. Ordinarily, this sediment simply accumulates, year after year, a slow rain of mineral snow settling into the dark. But at a subduction zone, some of that sediment gets carried down along with the descending plate, dragged into the Earth's mantle, where intense heat and pressure eventually cook it, releasing carbon dioxide that can, over spans of millions of years, work its way back up through volcanic activity and return to the atmosphere. It is, in other words, one of the planet's own long, patient breathing cycles, taking carbon out of the water and the air, burying it in stone, and eventually giving some portion of it back, on a time scale so vast that it makes human history look like the blink of an eye. Given how important trenches are to earthquakes and to this deep carbon cycle, it's worth sitting for a moment with just how deep some of them actually go, because the numbers involved are strange enough to be almost impossible to hold in your head using ordinary experience as a guide. The deepest of all is the Mariana Trench, curving along the western edge of the Pacific near the Mariana Islands, and within it lies a specific depression named Challenger Deep, first identified by the crew of the British survey ship HMS Challenger in 1875, using nothing more sophisticated than a weighted rope lowered patiently over the side and measured as it played out. Later expeditions, using sonar rather than rope, refined that early estimate, and the figure that researchers now generally arrive at places the bottom of Challenger Deep at roughly 36,000 feet below the surface, though the precise number varies slightly depending on the survey and the equipment used, since measuring the deepest point on Earth turns out to be almost as difficult as reaching it. Picture, if it helps, taking Mount Everest, that famous peak that climbers spend months preparing to summit, and lowering it whole into this trench. The very top of the mountain, the point where flags are planted and photographs are taken, would still sit under more than a mile of water above it. That comparison gets used often enough that it can start to feel like a piece of trivia rather than a genuine fact about the world. But it's worth pausing on anyway, because it means that this single crack in the seafloor, barely wider than a highway in places, is deep enough to swallow the tallest thing that land has ever produced and still have room left over. Descending into a place like this, whether inside a submersible or simply in imagination, the pressure becomes a subject impossible to set aside. At the surface, the air around you presses down at roughly the weight you're used to, a pressure so constant and familiar that you never notice it at all. By the time you reach the bottom of Challenger Deep, that pressure has grown to over 1,000 times what it is at the surface, equivalent to the weight of about 50 jumbo jets stacked on a single square inch. Any ordinary human body, unprotected, would be crushed instantly and completely, which is exactly why every crude descent into this trench has relied on an extraordinarily strong, thick-walled sphere to protect its occupants, a small, round room of metal or specially engineered material built specifically to resist forces that would otherwise flatten it in a fraction of a second. And yet, even here, in conditions that sound almost designed to be lifeless, life persists. Researchers have found amphipods, small shrimp-like crustaceans, drifting along the trench floor, along with certain single-celled organisms and even some fish species adapted to function at pressures that would destroy the proteins and membranes of almost any other creature on Earth. Exactly how life manages this, and exactly where the true outer boundary of habitability lies, whether at Challenger Deep or somewhere deeper still that we simply haven't explored yet, remains a genuinely open question, one that researchers continue to study rather than one with a tidy, settled answer. It's a fitting thought to carry with us as we drift now toward the very edges of what the deep ocean is willing to sustain at all. Let's shift our attention now, gently, away from the crushing pressures of the trench itself, and toward something quieter, but in many ways just as consequential, the role this vast, dark body of water plays in shaping the climate of the entire planet, including the air above the very bed you're lying in right now. It's easy, lying somewhere warm and dry, to think of climate as something that happens mostly in the sky, in clouds and wind and sunlight. But the ocean, and especially the deep ocean, is quietly doing an enormous share of the work, absorbing and storing and slowly releasing heat on timescales so long they're difficult to hold in the mind all at once. Water is remarkably good at holding on to warmth. If you've ever noticed how a swimming pool stays warm long after the sun has gone down, or how a lake can feel almost balmy on a cool autumn evening, you felt a small, local version of this same property. Water resists changing its temperature more than air does, more than rock does, more than nearly anything else common on the surface of the earth. Multiply that stubbornness by the sheer volume of the ocean, which contains something like 1,000 times more heat capacity than the entire atmosphere combined, and you begin to sense why scientists so often describe the ocean as the planet's thermal flywheel, a great, slow-turning mass that absorbs excess warmth and then releases it back out again, gradually, over years and decades and centuries. Most of that heat exchange happens near the surface, in the sunlit layer where water meets air directly. But heat doesn't simply stay there. Through a set of large looping currents that circle the globe, some of that warmth gets carried downward, folded into deeper water, and sent traveling along paths that can take it thousands of miles from where it started, and centuries to complete a single loop. Oceanographers sometimes call this system the global conveyor belt, though the water itself doesn't move in anything so tidy as a belt. It's really a slow braid of currents, driven by differences in temperature and salinity. Cold, salty water sinking near the poles because it's denser than what surrounds it, then creeping along the ocean floor toward the equator, warming and rising elsewhere, over what researchers estimate can be anywhere from several hundred to well over 1,000 years for a single complete circuit. A drop of water sinking near Greenland tonight might not resurface in any meaningful sense until long after everyone reading or listening to these words has become a distant memory. This slowness matters more than it might first seem to. It means the deep ocean acts as a kind of buffer, softening and delaying the effects of whatever is happening at the surface. Heat that enters the ocean today doesn't simply vanish into the depths and disappear from consequence. It gets stored, sometimes for a very long time, before eventually working its way back toward the surface and influencing weather, currents, and climate patterns far in the future. This is part of why scientists studying climate change pay such close attention to ocean heat content specifically, rather than only tracking air temperature. The atmosphere responds relatively quickly to changes in energy, warming and cooling within years. The ocean, and particularly its deeper layers, responds far more slowly, which means some of the true consequences of today's warming may not be fully expressed for a very long time yet, quietly working their way downward and outward like a stone sinking through honey. Heat isn't the only thing being redistributed by these slow-moving currents. Oxygen, so essential to nearly all deep-sea life, doesn't originate in the deep ocean at all. It enters the water almost entirely at or near the surface, produced by microscopic plant-like organisms called phytoplankton during photosynthesis, or absorbed directly from the atmosphere where wind and waves churn air into water. From there, oxygen has to travel downward, carried largely by the same sinking of cold, dense water near the poles that drives the great conveyor of currents. This is part of why the very deepest, oldest water in the ocean, the water that has been circulating for many centuries, tends to carry less oxygen than water that sank more recently. It has simply had more time for oxygen to be consumed by the animals and microbes living within it, with less opportunity to be replenished, since there is no equivalent source of fresh oxygen production happening in total darkness thousands of meters below. Nutrients travel in something like the opposite direction, and this exchange turns out to be just as important to how life persists at depth. As organisms in the sunlit surface waters live, feed, and eventually die, their remains, along with waste and other organic material, begin a slow descent toward the seafloor. Scientists sometimes refer to this steady downward drift as marine snow, a soft and rather lovely name for what is, functionally, a constant rain of biological debris, falling continuously, day and night, across every ocean on Earth. Most of it gets consumed long before it reaches bottom, intercepted by fish and shrimp-like creatures, and countless microbes suspended at every level of the water column, each taking their share as it falls. But some fraction continues all the way down, arriving eventually at the deep seafloor, where it becomes food for the sediment-dwelling creatures we've already spent time with, the sea cucumbers and worms and brittle stars quietly sifting through mud for whatever nutrition has managed to survive the long journey from sunlight to darkness. This whole process, carbon captured near the surface by living organisms and then carried downward as those organisms die and sink, has a name among researchers who study it closely: the biological carbon pump. It's called a pump not because anything mechanical is doing the pushing, but because the net effect is remarkably similar: carbon steadily transferred from the surface, where it could otherwise linger in the atmosphere as a heat-trapping gas, down into the deep ocean, where some portion of it can remain locked away for centuries, or, in certain cases, far longer still. Estimates vary and continue to be refined as research improves, but the biological carbon pump appears to move several billion tons of carbon out of the surface ocean and into the deep sea and its sediments every single year, making it one of the largest natural processes moving carbon around the entire planet, quietly running in the dark, entirely without human involvement or awareness, for as long as there has been life in the sea to sink. What ties all of this together, heat, oxygen, nutrients, carbon, is the same essential quality we've circled back to more than once tonight. The deep ocean moves slowly, and it remembers. Changes that happen at the surface, whether from a passing storm, a shift in seasonal winds, or a longer-term change in the planet's climate, don't reach the abyss right away. They ripple downward gradually, arriving at depth years or decades or centuries after they first began, the way a sound might take a long moment to reach you across a very large, very still room. This means the deep ocean we observe today isn't only a record of current conditions, it's also, in part, a record of conditions from long ago, still working their way downward, still arriving. And it means that whatever changes are happening at the surface right now, gently, quietly, are already beginning their own slow journey into the dark, patient water below, a journey we're only just beginning to understand how to trace. It's worth sitting with that idea for a moment, because it changes the shape of a question people often ask, which is whether human activity actually reaches somewhere as remote as the deep sea. The honest answer, gathered slowly and sometimes reluctantly by researchers over the past several decades, is that it already has, in ways both obvious and startlingly subtle. Take plastic, for instance. In 2019, a piloted submersible descended into the Mariana Trench, nearly 11 kilometers down, deeper than any point in the ocean, deeper than Everest is tall if you turned the mountain upside down and dropped it into the sea. Waiting there, at that almost incomprehensible depth, cameras found a plastic bag. Not dramatic wreckage, not a large mass of debris, just an ordinary plastic bag, the kind someone might carry groceries in, resting quietly on sediment that had likely gone undisturbed for longer than human civilization has existed. It wasn't an isolated find either. Researchers studying sediment cores and the guts of deep-sea animals have found microplastic fibers, tiny threads far too small to see without magnification, in some of the most remote trenches on Earth, carried down by the same slow currents and sinking particles that deliver food to the deep-sea floor. The ocean, it turns out, doesn't just move nutrients and carbon downward, it moves whatever we put into it too, patiently, without any regard for how far that place is from anywhere a person has ever stood. Noise travels differently than plastic, but it travels just as far, and in some ways it may matter more to the animals that live there. Sound moves through water roughly 4 times faster than it moves through air, and it can carry over enormous distances, especially at the low frequencies produced by large ships, sonar systems, and seismic survey equipment used to search for oil and gas deposits beneath the seafloor. Some deep-diving whales, like sperm whales, communicate and navigate using sound across many kilometers, listening to the ocean the way we might listen to a room. Researchers who study underwater acoustics have documented a real increase in background ocean noise over the past century, driven mostly by the growth of global shipping. And while the full consequences for deep-sea life are still being worked out carefully rather than assumed, there's reasonable concern that a noisier ocean is a harder ocean to navigate and communicate within, for creatures that depend on quiet the way we depend on darkness for sleep. Fishing reaches the deep sea too, though perhaps not in the way most people picture when they imagine a fishing boat. Trawlers equipped with heavy nets sometimes drag along the seafloor itself, targeting fish that live near seamounts and continental slopes, structures that, as we talked about earlier, can take corals many centuries to build. A single pass of a bottom trawl can flatten decades or centuries of slow coral growth in a matter of minutes, clearing a section of seafloor the way a plow clears a field, except that unlike a field, there's no next season of regrowth to look forward to, not on any time scale a person would recognize. Some deep-sea fish are especially vulnerable to this kind of pressure precisely because they grow so slowly and live so long. The orange roughy, a fish found near seamounts at depths of several hundred meters, can live well over 100 years and doesn't begin reproducing until it's several decades old. Fisheries that grew rapidly around this species in the late 20th century, once its slow-cooked, mild-tasting flesh became popular on dinner tables, ended up depleting some populations faster than those fish could possibly replace themselves. A mismatch between how quickly we can take and how slowly the deep sea can give back. Then there's a newer question, one that hasn't been fully answered yet because the activity itself hasn't really begun at any meaningful scale. Deep sea mining. Scattered across certain areas of the abyssal plain, particularly in a region of the Central Pacific called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, the seafloor is covered in potato-sized lumps called polymetallic nodules, formed with almost unimaginable slowness as minerals dissolved in seawater precipitate out around a tiny core, a shark's tooth or a fragment of shell, growing perhaps a few millimeters every million years. These nodules happen to be rich in metals like nickel, cobalt, and manganese, materials used in batteries and electronics, and that has drawn serious commercial interest in mining them. Companies and countries have proposed sending machines down to vacuum these nodules off the seafloor and bring them to the surface. It's a proposal, not yet a settled reality, and it remains genuinely contested. Some see it as a necessary source of materials for a world trying to move away from fossil fuels. Others, including many of the scientists who've spent their careers studying these areas, point out that we still don't fully understand what lives on and around these nodules, or how long it might take those communities to recover if disturbed, given how slowly everything in the deep sea seems to happen. Small-scale test mining operations conducted so far have shown that tracks left in the sediment by mining equipment can remain visible for decades afterward, largely unhealed. A reminder that in a place without wind or rain to smooth things over, damage doesn't erase itself the way it might on land. All of which brings us, gently, to a harder and more honest admission, one that deep-sea researchers tend to make without any embarrassment, because it's simply true. We have explored a remarkably small fraction of the deep ocean floor. Estimates vary, depending on exactly what counts as meaningful exploration, but figures commonly cited by oceanographers suggest that somewhere between 5 and 20% of the seafloor has been mapped in detail, and only a much smaller sliver than that has actually been visited, photographed, or sampled directly. We have, in a very real sense, better maps of the surface of Mars and the far side of the Moon than we do of large stretches of our own ocean floor, simply because water is so much harder to see through than empty space. And it isn't only the seafloor itself that remains largely unknown. Scientists have increasingly come to appreciate that a vast biosphere exists not just on the seafloor, but within it, in the sediment layers, and even in the rock beneath, where microorganisms have been found living at depths of hundreds of meters below the seafloor, in some cases apparently surviving on timescales of thousands of years between meals, growing so slowly that a single generation might outlast entire human civilizations. Some researchers now estimate that this deep subsurface biosphere may contain a substantial portion, by some counts nearly as much, of all the microbial life on Earth, hidden away in rock and mud that most of us will never see or think about, quietly persisting in conditions that would have seemed impossible for life to occupy at all, until someone actually went looking. There's something worth holding on to in all of this, as the night goes on and your thoughts, like the water above the abyss, begin to settle and slow. The deep ocean is not a finished story. It isn't a place we've already mapped and cataloged and understood, filed away the way an old photograph gets filed into an album. It's still very much being discovered, one expedition, one sediment core, one strange new organism at a time, and much of what lies down there, in the cold, dark, patient water covering most of our planet, remains, for now, genuinely unknown. And so, if you can, imagine now that we begin to rise. Not quickly. Nothing in the deep ocean happens quickly, and there's no reason for us to break that pattern now. Imagine the slow release of a submersible's ballast, water pushed gently out of tanks by compressed air, the vessel losing just enough of its negative buoyancy that it starts, almost imperceptibly at first, to drift upward through black water that has no current to speak of, no light to mark the passage of time, nothing but the occasional cold flash of a lanternfish, or the pale drifting bell of some jellyfish, neither of us will ever be able to name. The ascent from the deepest trenches can take hours, and for most of those hours there is nothing at all to see, only the sonar ping, the hum of instruments, the quiet company of your own breathing in a metal shell, surrounded by a pressure that would crush an unprotected body in an instant. And yet you would not feel unsafe if you were there. You would feel, more likely, something closer to what you might feel right now, lying still in the dark, aware of your own breath moving in and out, aware that the space around you is larger than you can see, and that this is, somehow, all right. We've traveled through a great deal of ocean tonight, from the sunlit shallows down through the twilight zone, where light thins to a blue so faint it barely counts as light at all, and creatures like the hatchetfish angle their bodies to erase their own shadows, down further into full darkness where the water pressure builds by roughly 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of depth, until at the bottom of the Mariana Trench it reaches over 1,000 times what you feel on the surface of the Earth right now, a pressure equivalent, as oceanographers sometimes describe it, to balancing 50 jumbo jets on top of a single person, and yet somewhere in that crushing weight of water, amphipods the size of your thumb go about their lives as if none of it mattered. We passed through hydrothermal vents, chimneys of mineral and heat rising from cracks in the Earth's crust, black smoke pouring into cold water at temperatures that can exceed 350 degrees Celsius, and around those vents we found entire communities of life running not on sunlight, the way almost everything on the surface of our planet does, but on chemistry alone, on bacteria that convert hydrogen sulfide into energy through a process called chemosynthesis, first properly understood only in the late 1970s, when scientists aboard a small submersible called Alvin found tube worms and clams clustered around vents in the Galapagos Rift, and realized, with something like disbelief, that they were looking at an entirely separate way for life to exist. We drifted past whale falls, the slow, decades-long feast that follows a single whale carcass down to the seafloor, an entire ecosystem built on one death, unfolding in stages that can outlast the lifespan of the scientists who first began studying them. And we sat, for a while, with the marine snow, that endless quiet drift of organic material falling from above, the flakes of dead plankton and shed skin, and waste that settle, some of it, for tens of thousands of years, into the layered history of the seafloor itself, a record patient enough to remember ice ages and asteroid impacts in bands of sediment no thicker than a few centimeters per millennium. If there is a single thread running beneath everything we've talked about tonight, it might be this: scale. Not scale in the sense of a number that impresses you and then evaporates, but scale in the sense of trying, gently, to hold two true things in your mind at once. The ocean is almost incomprehensibly vast, containing more living space than every other habitat on Earth combined, home to more biomass, by some estimates, than exists on all the land and in all the air put together. And within that vastness, individual lives go on at every scale, from the microorganisms buried in sediment beneath the seafloor, dividing perhaps once every few thousand years, to the sperm whale diving a mile down in pursuit of squid it can sense only through echoes, bouncing back through absolute dark. Bigness and smallness aren't opposites in the deep sea. They're simply two ways of describing the same patient, ongoing process of life finding a way to persist, however slowly, however strangely, in conditions that would have seemed, to almost anyone standing on a beach a few centuries ago, entirely uninhabitable. There's a kind of comfort available in that thought, if you let it settle, rather than trying to grasp it all at once. You don't have to understand the ocean to be soothed by it. You don't have to memorize the names of trenches, or the mechanisms of bioluminescence, or the exact temperature at which vent water boils without boiling, because the pressure won't allow it to. You only have to imagine, quietly, that all of this exists, right now, while you lie here, somewhere below the surface of the water covering most of this planet, in complete darkness. A giant squid's eye the size of a dinner plate is turned toward nothing in particular. A tube worm several feet long is drawing chemical energy from a vent that has been erupting, in one form or another, for longer than human civilization has existed. A sediment core is quietly recording, layer by layer, the slow chemistry of a world older than any story we've ever told about it. None of it requires your attention to keep happening. It simply continues, the way your breath continues, in and out, without you needing to direct it. Speaking of which, if you haven't noticed already, you might notice now the slight rise and fall of your chest, the small pause between one breath and the next, roughly the same pause you might imagine hanging in the water just before a deep-diving whale tips forward into its next descent. You don't need to change anything about how you're breathing. You don't need to make it slower, or deeper, or more deliberate. Just notice it, the way you might notice a research vessel notices the ocean around it, without disturbing the water, simply floating there, listening. We began this journey near the surface, in a place still lit by the sun, and we're ending it there too, having gone all the way down and slowly, patiently, come back. That's not so different from what a body does every single night, sinking down through its own stages of rest, deeper and quieter, before eventually beginning its own gentle ascent back toward morning. You don't have to do any of that work yourself. Your body already knows the way, the same way water finds its way down through the layers of the ocean and, eventually, all the way back up again, one slow degree of temperature at a time. So let the descent finish, if it hasn't already. Let whatever is left of the day dissolve the way light dissolves past 200 meters, not suddenly, but by degrees, so small you'd never notice the exact moment it disappeared. There is no need to hold on to anything from tonight, no facts to keep, no names of trenches or creatures to carry forward into sleep. The ocean will still be there in the morning, unbothered, unfinished, mostly unexplored, exactly as it has been for longer than there have been minds around to wonder about it. And you can simply rest now, the way the deepest water rests, moving so slowly it hardly seems to move at all, patient, dark, and entirely undisturbed. And there is something worth sitting with, quietly, before we let it go entirely. How much of that darkness remains unmet? Scientists estimate that we have described, named, and understood perhaps a small fraction of the species living in the deep ocean. Some suggest as little as 10%, others less, and the rest exist in a kind of patient anonymity, swimming or drifting or anchored to the seafloor, without ever having been seen by a human eye, without a name in any language, without a single photograph to mark that they were here. Every research expedition that lowers a camera or a net into those deep trenches still returns, more often than not, with something previously unrecorded, a translucent creature no one has catalogued, a pattern of bioluminescence no one has described, a shape so unfamiliar that the scientists aboard have to invent new words just to begin talking about it to one another. This isn't a failure of science. It's simply the size of the question. The deep ocean covers more of this planet than every mountain range and forest and desert combined, and it does so in 3 dimensions, in layers of water stacked for miles, each one its own kind of country with its own quiet population, largely unmapped, mostly unmet, and entirely uninterested in whether we ever get around to finding it. There's a kind of humility in that, the good kind, the kind that doesn't ask you to feel small in a way that diminishes you, but instead invites you to feel small in a way that makes the world feel larger and more generous than you'd assumed. Because if we haven't finished discovering the deep ocean, then it isn't finished either. Not as a subject, not as a place. It's still becoming known, slowly, the way anything worth understanding becomes known, through patience rather than urgency, through years of careful observation rather than a single triumphant answer. The scientists working on this don't rush it. They can't. The pressure, the darkness, the sheer distance involved won't allow for rushing. And so a kind of stewardship has grown up around the work itself, an understanding that whatever remains hidden down there deserves to be approached carefully, studied without being emptied out, protected even while it's still being learned about, because so much of what lives in that darkness took an unimaginably long time to become what it is, and could not be replaced quickly if it were lost. Some of the corals discovered on seamounts in the deep sea are thought to be many thousands of years old, older than most of what we consider ancient on land, and they grow so slowly that a human lifetime barely registers against theirs. To know that, and still choose carefulness over haste, is its own kind of quiet discipline, one practiced by people you will never meet, in places you will never see, on your behalf as much as anyone else's. You don't have to carry any of that responsibility tonight. It isn't yours to hold right now, and it wasn't given to you as a task. It was only offered as a thought, one more current passing through the water, here and then gone, the way everything else tonight has been offered rather than assigned. Your only job at this hour is the one your body has already begun without needing instructions. Settling, softening, letting the muscles around your eyes and your jaw and your shoulders remember that they don't need to hold anything up right now. Not vigilance, not understanding, not even wakefulness itself, if it's ready to go. Let your attention come back up now, slowly, the way it would if you were ascending from any great depth, unhurried, careful of no particular pressure, because there's no pressure here to be careful of. Back past the layers we traveled down through, back toward the surface, back toward this room, this bed, this ordinary night. if it can even be called ordinary, given everything happening beneath every ocean on the planet at this very moment, indifferent to your attention, and entirely unaffected by whether you stay awake to think about it any further. You don't need to. You've arrived back where you started, a little heavier with sleep than when we began, which is exactly where you're meant to be. Rest well,